I had a lot of issues with God when I went into sobriety. I would hear the Lord's Prayer and I would flinch.
So-called quote-unquote rationalists or scientific absolutists are the ones telling you have to like hide in a bunker for the next century or you're killing grandma with COVID.
Which version of you is better? It's really not hard.
The first sip from the cup of science turns you into an atheist, but when you drain the cup all the way to the bottom, God is waiting for you there.
When I'm on that train of nihilism, it is a train to nowhere. It leads nowhere. It is empty. It is dark, and it is nothing matters, including my life.
There genuinely are people who, under cover of pretending to be religious, kind of try to undermine people's basic moral intuition. In the immigration debate, you get a lot of people who will use like certain passages from the Bible to say, well, like you can't be a Christian and believe in borders. You have to dissolve your country into soup if you really want to honor God.
All right, I'm with Spencer Klavan, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins. Welcome. So good to have you.
For having me. It's awesome to be here. I feel like we've known each other from afar in various digital media, and it's awesome to finally like get a
We've
chance
met
to
in person though.
That's true. We've also met in 3 dimensions, more importantly.
Not just digitally.
Right.
Where were we? I think you were at I feel like we were both at a Daily Wire movie premiere of
That's what I
some
was going to say.
sort
Was it
in
wasn't
LA.
anti-racist, but it was
No, it was in Los Angeles.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't Am I a Woman? It was, what was it?
Man.
This is a real testament to our memories that we can't even remember what it was. I thought was it an Adam Carolla movie?
Oh, that sounds Adam Carolla was there. Viewers, you are watching 2 people decomposing in real time. This is age happening live on
Mom
screen.
brain. Wait, now it's gonna drive me crazy. Was it Prager? Was he was there? Everyone
Prager
was
was
there.
there.
It was
There
they
were a
they all
lot of
still live
like
there.
Yeah. There were a lot of pre-show appearances by various people, including perhaps Jordan Peterson.
Oh, this is gonna drive me nuts. It was some big movie, or like maybe it was a documentary.
It was a documentary about the environment. It was Jonathan Hayes. No, am I wrong?
What was it about?
It was like environmentalism is all fake.
Bullshit?
Bullshit.
Was that
Yes.
it? I don't know. Anyway, we'll
Well,
remember. It'll come to us. So that's where we met the first time in person. I think I've met you again in person somewhere else, but it's tough when you're like all over the place in these different communities and places.
disembodied, totally.
Disembodied and embodied. We
Right.
were just talking before we started recording about how we're both dinosaurs about books, but here's one thing that I will say as a new parent is that one of the, when I got sober, there was a lot of talk about like I had a sponsor who said make a list of I'm a woman who and the kind of woman you want to be. It was very simple when I got sober. Like I am a woman who has a skincare routine. I am a woman who drinks, X ounces of water a day, who blah, blah, blah. It actually really does work
Is
because
remain
it's
moisturized, very demure, etc.
yeah. But it was just this right what kind of woman you want to be. And then I have applied this to being a mother. And I don't want her to see us staring at screens all day. And I do want her to be a kid who says, I mean, maybe this isn't going to be the case at all, but I would like for her to be a child who's like, oh, my parents were always reading. Now, if you're staring at a screen reading a book, your kid doesn't even know the difference.
That's such a good point. And that's really profound, like that recovery translated into parenthood for you. I have never been through recovery, but many people in my family have. And I always think about when I started college, I'm pretty sure now in retrospect that I went through depression or something that you might call being depressed. And this was also right after I had been baptized. So it was a major kind of like formative period for my prayer life. And I talk all the time about praying to God for the motivation to brush my teeth, because I feel like we think about these transformative things in these grand terms, but actually these grand terms are made up of these tiny things, like seeing your mom reading a paper book. I mean, I grew up surrounded by that. It totally transformed me, I'm sure, and definitely made my upbringing different from that of my peers.
That's really interesting, the praying for the motivation to brush your teeth, because it is one of those people don't quite understand how debilitating depression can be, and that they'll be like, "Well, why don't you just get up and work out? And why don't you just," and it's like, that's the problem. You can't find the motivation to do anything. It's so depression's so insidious in that respect, and even in recovery when there's a lot of similar overlap. And I think when I got sober, I experienced depression that I didn't even know I maybe wrestled with, or maybe it was situational, just getting all the substances out of my system for the first time in decades. But it was building on, and again, this goes back to kind of atomic habits, just building on those little tiny things that life is made up of, these tiny little habits that you just build on that become a life.
Yeah,
And it is kind of a way to baby step your way out of some like depression, or because sometimes it's just like that little act of brushing your teeth is enough to make you feel better, just even for a minute.
100%. And something I'm really obsessed with is the mistake people make, myself included, about like virtue and goodness and being a good person or whatever, because you have to stop yourself from doing a lot of things. Like maybe you have to kick an alcohol addiction or another substance abuse addiction. There's all sorts of things you have to not do in order to quote unquote live a good life. So get to talking as if like goodness is just denying yourself all this fun stuff. Like it's just the negative is what goodness is about. But it's actually the exact opposite. It's like you say no to things so that you can say yes to other bigger, better things. And at the atomic habit level, I think that like consists in a reframing, like a shift in mindset where you don't say, I don't get to sleep for the next hour. You say instead, like, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to actually notice that it feels amazing. Like I'm genuinely in the business of mining life for awesome sauce, and
Mhm.
focusing on the rewards instead of the cost is like a huge shift, at least in my life. I think a lot of people talk about this in the opposite way, like, oh, I'm giving up this or that. Even like, really dark stuff like online when people say I'm giving up porn. I have a porn addiction. I'm giving up porn. Like, totally get that. Seems really virtuous, but what are you getting instead? Like,
Right.
what are you actually reaching out for is really important.
I had a hard time with recovery because it did seem so negative. It was I had to make my life when I got sober, I had to be, and it wasn't the first time I had kind of I'd done experimental sobriety. I had been sober in a rehab when I was 19 for other more serious substances, and I knew that just focusing on not doing something wouldn't be enough to keep me sober. So I had to focus on it being something more that I was curious about. I was just, it had to be something bigger. It had to be something more optimistic. I couldn't just focus on I can't do alcohol. I can't
Yeah,
drink alcohol. I can't smoke weed, because that just wasn't going to be enough to stay sober, which is, I think, something like the genius of the 12 steps is that first one is admit you're powerless over substances or whatever it might be. As you go deeper into sobriety and longer, it becomes people, places, things. Like I apply it to the world when I start kind of spinning out or going into doomerism. It's like,
yeah,
okay, I'm not powerless over drones. I'm powerless over drones, powerless over China. What can I actually control in my life? It's like three things. But then it gets into admitting your I had a lot of issues with God when I went into sobriety,
mm,
because I was raised Catholic, and I kind of joked that I was more of a recovering Catholic. And I would hear the Lord's Prayer and I would flinch, even in my 30s when I got sober this time.
bro.
And
Many such cases. Yeah,
yeah, so many cases.
yeah,
And then the third step is, came to understand that, like, basically God, or God as you understand him or it or whatever, which is truly the genius of that program. It does
Mm,
not require that you believe in God. Eventually, I think you do come to believe in God if you
mhm,
stay long enough, or even people have this experience in a very short period of time.
mm,
But it doesn't require it. It just has to be something greater than you,
yeah.
which is so profound when you're struggling in an attic. For me, it was literally dogs. I was like,
Really?
dog is God spelled backwards, and they're everywhere. And if I'm just going through life and I want to drink or I'm struggling and there's a high chance that I'll see a dog and I'll be like, oh,
Mm.
something bigger. It just became like a stand-in for me. So
Oh,
tell
wow.
me about because your book has a lot to do with a lot of tell me about your book and why you were inspired to write it.
Definitely. Actually, it's right in line with some of what we're talking about because this is one of those subjects that drives me insane when people talk about it online. Depression, too, by the
Oh,
way,
yeah.
where you get into you stake out these incredibly absolutist positions like therapy is garbage and never
Yeah.
helps anyone. You just need prayer, or like, prayer is garbage and all you need, whatever. And as you're saying, in real people's real lives, this stuff is much more gradual and it's much more about meeting people where they are. And evangelism, which is another one of those church words that goes right up people's spines, is a great example of this. People think that they have an obligation to evangelism that amounts basically to standing on the street corner with some sign that says like repent or go to hell. Or it's like, if I don't come out of this conversation with the other person affirming every point of the Nicene Creed, then I've personally failed as a Christian, right? Like I need like from 0 to 100% from this person commitment right now. And really, if you look at the way God, I think, works with people and what is most effective in general, it's what's the next step in front of you. I mean, C.S. Lewis, one of my great Christian heroes, talks about his journey out of atheism into, of course, like a really creedal Christianity. But it starts with like Wordsworth, who is not really a traditional Christian and something more, at least in his early writing, it's kind of more like God is everywhere, God is in everything. And it's like, would C.S. Lewis endorse that now? No. But did C.S. Lewis need that at the moment when it was the next step out of atheism, like to believe in something? Yes. So I raise all this because I think a lot of people my age and, on either side of my generation, like a little older, a little younger, one of the huge obstacles before you even get into talking about the Bible and denominations and all these creedal questions, one of the huge obstacles to faith is, does science disprove God? Do I have to give up on my rational mind in order to contemplate the existence of something higher than me, an absolute morality, a power beyond this human life, some kind of transcendent horizon, all this stuff? And, when I converted to Christianity, which was, I was 16, I was surrounded by like all the nerd kids. My buddies and I were the guys that went into the library at lunchtime to do extra calculus problems. Like I never stood a chance with, with like, dating. And uh and it was just assumed that what I was doing by converting was like creating this like irrational space in my life where I shelved everything else that I knew about math and science and hard realities. And as I've gotten older and I, went to grad school and studied classics and, became kind of a professional egghead, it dawned on me how wildly ahistorical this is, this idea that faith and reason are somehow in conflict with one another. And so I think we're at a point now where a lot of people want to believe. They feel a need for a higher meaning in life, but this remains a huge stumbling block. And the book is basically an attempt to just do a hard reset on that entire story about the conflict between science and religion. I tell the history of science in what I hope is like a much more readable and exciting way than you might think. Start with the Greeks and the Babylonians and go all the way up to quantum physics and just say, look, like this is a science is an enormous achievement of humanity. It's a great gift to the world. It's also a product of Christendom. It's a result of Christian principles and the belief that there is a God out there whose rational mind answers to ours. And not only that, but the era that produced this idea of the conflict between science and faith is actually like way outdated. And for about a
Mhm.
hundred years, science has been uncovering all of these mysteries that are making real scientists say, you know what, like there is more to the world than just like bodies in motion. And actually, it's quite possible that on the other side of this earthly life, there is a mind that does the creating. So that's the book. And it's designed basically for both for Christians who are worried that science is hostile to them, but also for seekers who are worried that God wants to take away their brains. Basically, it's kind of a reconciliation of those two perspectives.
Yeah, there's so much in that, even just on a personal level. My husband and I talk about this a lot because we kind of both came in, I would say, probably atheistic and in recovery, which is where we met.
Yeah,
And then we talk a lot about God and how we feel about it, and, I've become much more of a believer, although I'm not necessarily practicing a specific faith
yeah.
yet, although I made the joke when I was at Dissident Dialogues that I was like, "We're all gonna be Christian, that's just the path we're on." Um, but and everyone in this room in the IDW,
Oh yeah,
I do
it's
think
totally true. By the way, you're 100% right about that. It's okay. Like take your time, but yeah, it is
Yeah,
impactful.
and so there have been moments that are I look at so many things, even the recent passing of my dog, the way that played out, where we ended up, it was this based animal place that just I mean, it's like, how can I not believe? And yet there's still that rational mind part of me
Yeah,
that doesn't want to believe or is resistant to believing or thinks that I'm somehow ridiculous for believing.
yeah.
And as my husband and I always kind of land on, and as he always says, which version of you is better? It's
Mm.
really not hard. It's actually not hard. I
Yeah,
don't even need to believe or not. If I
yeah.
start with which version of me is a better person, the version who believes or the
Mm,
version who does, it doesn't matter if it's real or not.
mm.
There's something profound in terms of that being a gateway into a deeper belief.
The other question is which version of you is more rational? Because there was a time, I think, like in the 20th century, when it seemed like all the smart, rational people were the ones who didn't believe in God because they had the courage to face up to the world as it quote unquote really is, right? And I think about the rise of the new atheists and guys like Richard Dawkins, who were so big when I was a kid, and the way in which that has totally flipped on its head in the last like 20 years. So that now the so called quote unquote rationalists or scientific absolutists are the ones telling you you have to like hide in a bunker for the next century or you're killing grandma with COVID, or they're telling you that like indigenous knowledge is science. I mean, there is this breakdown going on now of the so called rationalist position. And a lot of people, you are definitely not the only one saying like, okay, the fruits of these two philosophies are really different. And Ion Hersey Ali, I don't know if you're familiar with
Of
her.
course.
Yeah, incredibly courageous woman who had a big impact on me when I was kind of a teenager. But back then, she was an atheist. She had escaped a horrifying Islamist regime, and at a different scale, it's sort of similar to what you're describing about the Catholic Church. I don't think the Catholic Church is anywhere near as bad as the Islamist regime that Ali came out of, but it was a similar thing. It was like, why would I ever want to believe in a God who did this to me or in whose name this was done to me? But she published this very transformative piece in Unheard where she said, ultimately, I started asking, like, where do all of these things that I believe in come from? Like liberal democracy, human rights, the idea that we are endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. These are all ideas that have like a very explicit metaphysical underpinning. Like they depend on faith in God. And so at a certain point, actually, like as you follow that train, you start to look back and say, well, why was I worried about becoming irrational if I became religious? Like these ideas actually make more sense with a theistic underpinning than less. It's not a proof of God. I don't think there's anything like that in the world. That's part of the point of faith. But it does seem like that evidence should count for something that you're describing. That's part of the evidence.
She also talks, I mean, it's moving when she talks about the rock bottom that she had that led her to, in many ways, in the same experience I had, where I have had rational people push back against me, and I'm like, "Good for you. Good that you've never been brought to your knees like that. Congratulations, and I hope you never are." Because that was when she was having this conversation with Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
You know, he was almost, it's like the tone he took with her was so unappealing to me because it was so condescending and just almost ridiculing her for finding this belief after she expresses very articulately and beautifully about this extremely difficult period in her life where she wanted to die and
Mhm.
didn't have meaning and didn't see meaning. And I think this is the danger with a lot of why which version of me is better,
Yeah.
because the version without some kind of faith when I'm on that train of nihilism, it is a train to nowhere. It
Yeah.
leads nowhere. It is empty. It is dark, and it is nothing matters, including my life, nothing.
Yeah.
And at least with this, faith of some kind, there is meaning and there's some purpose. And I've seen people get through incredibly. One of the first interviews I did for this podcast, actually, it was one of the early ones, was with a woman whose son died in the middle of the night, 12 years old. They still don't know why. He
Mm.
just literally died in the middle of the night and was gone. And it
Yeah.
wasn't like he had a condition, nothing. And she says on that podcast, and I'll never forget it, that she became a believer overnight because
Mm.
she had to be. It was either she was like struck with faith and belief
Yeah.
at a time when you would not expect to be. It
Mm.
was what saved her. She had another child, she talks about how it saved her, but I still think about that all the time because it's the worst thing imaginable. It's the time when my faith would be tested the most in anything.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that is very profound. I had a weirdly similar conversation recently. I've been doing this Advent series, the lead up to Christmas. Traditionally, we don't really do this anymore. We tend to like, pull out the Christmas lights on November 1st or whatever. But traditionally in the church, the period before Christmas is actually a period of silence, reflection, fasting, prayer, and even grief, which I think is really helpful. I mean, we all know that the holidays bring up a lot of painful, traumatic stuff for a lot of people. And the OG church, like, going back centuries, makes that space before the joy of Christmas to like encounter your suffering. So I've been writing about this and kind of sending out little passages that I think are helpful. And one of the passages I sent out is Charles Dickens, who famously kind of created our idea of Christmas. And A Christmas Carol is one of my favorite Christmas stories ever. The 1951 movie with Alistair Sim, we watch every year and always have since I was a little kid in my family. And later on in his life, Dickens lost many children and suffered terribly from that. It was pretty commonplace in his time to
Yeah.
lose kids, but it wasn't any more fun than it is now. And he wrote an essay called "What Christmas Is to Us as We Grow Older." And he talks about when you're a little kid, Christmas is just this unmitigated joy. It's like all toys, all presents. And then every year that comes by, there's some disappointment that's hit you in life. There's something you've lost. And that comes with Christmas again and again. And he finally says, like, the true spirit of Christmas welcomes all of these sorrows around the
Mm.
hearth. And he says, I look at my children now, and I almost see the spirits of the ones that I lost around them. And he has this beautiful line. He says, the patriarchs, like Abraham in the Old Testament, guys entertained angels unawares, but we can see them, and they are like this integral part of our Christmas joy is the people that we've lost. Anyway, I sent this out, and one of my subscribers commented, I had never heard her say this before, that she also lost a son. I think she said he was in his 30s, and it was, again, totally no warning, overnight. And it was that moment, she said, that triggered her period of deepest sorrow, but also of deepest joy. And I think, like, unless you can countenance that and engage with that and acknowledge that that's something people go through, even if you haven't, right? I mean, even if you're Richard Dawkins and maybe you've never been through that, or you don't like to talk about it, or you've kind of shelved it away, whatever your philosophy of life is, it has to contain room for that. It has to have some answer for the fact that that happens in the world. And this outlook that we have now, which is kind of so data driven and so obsessed with numbers and the quantifiable, like, we're not able to even accept that as evidence. Like, we don't think it counts as evidence that this, you go into that dark valley, and one road is going to lead you out, and the other road is just going to lead you deeper in. And we think that that's just an accident, or it's just your subjective impressions or whatever. But I think that's data. Like, I actually think that's information about who we are and where we're going. So yeah, I mean, what's funny to me about the Dawkins exchange with Ali is that, on the one hand, he has no time or patience for that sorrow, or nothing to answer it with. On the other hand, he's out giving these other interviews where he says, "Well, now I'm a cultural Christian because, like, the world is falling apart around me, and I prefer Christmas lights to, like, public beheadings by Islamofascists." It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I would say so. And shouldn't that at least give you pause about the two civilizations that have been produced by these two different outlooks? I don't know. I think, like, at a certain point, people are starting to kind of become aware of this. I'm actually pretty hopeful about it for exactly the reasons we're talking about.
Yeah, it's such a I don't know, I love talking maybe it's the, like, Catholic in me, I do love talking about God, it's one and the belief in it and people it's been just I don't know, I find it fascinating to see the culture that we've produced without it for now. We've kind of lived through it in our lifetime.
Yeah.
We like you said, we were born of this like atheism, but wasn't even Einstein saying that the more he did science, the more he believed in God?
Oh, yeah. There's a great quote. This is often attributed to Werner Heisenberg. It's kind of one of those ones that goes around the internet in a bunch of different forms. But the form I really like is: the first sip from the cup of science turns you into an atheist, but when you drain the cup all the way to the bottom, God is waiting for you there.
Um,
And there are a lot of, I mean, the greatest scientific minds in history have almost universally been theists of some variety. It's very new development that science is associated with atheism, that we think all great scientists are atheists. And were told this story, a lot of us in school, this little morality tale about Galileo versus the big bad church, right? And that's
mhm.
kind of ground zero for this idea that the church just wants to shut down knowledge, and those who seek knowledge must cast off the shackles of religion. But again, and I cover this a lot in the book, like, if you go back and you read the actual primary sources from those moments, and you read the great architects of the scientific revolution, to a man, they were all believers, and most of them were Christians. Galileo was a believing Christian. Isaac Newton was, like, annotating the genealogies of Noah. He was, like, in there spurging out about, who, like, what does this passage mean? And he was deeply invested in that. Johannes Kepler, profoundly passionate Christian, and that's not an accident. I mean, they thought that what they were doing as seekers of truth was obeying God. Galileo says at one point, "God gave me my reason. God created nature, which is somehow shockingly answerable to my reason. Like when I go out into the world, this little monkey brain of mine has things in it that seem to apply everywhere. Like I have
Mm.
ideas like two and two plus two equals four in my head that don't just apply in my little neighborhood. They actually extend like billions of light years into space. And for these guys, that was the miracle. And the argument they were having with the church was what we should do about that, whether God wants us to use that to explore and find out everything we can on our own, or whether we should be constrained by what the church already teaches and knows. And that was the fight. It was a fight among Christians. And gradually over time, that idea turns into, well, if we can figure out so much on our own, we maybe don't need God. We have to throw God out in order to really, really know truth. And this is my favorite part of the story because it means we can blame the French, which I always, whenever I can, I want to do that. But French Enlightenment is really a major place where you get kind of the second gen scientists like Pierre Simon Laplace, these inheritors of Newton, who say, like, what do I need God for? But
Mm.
the joke is, by following that line, by following that kind of train of thought, you eventually end up with the quantum revolution and the discovery of Big Bang cosmology, like the thought that the universe does actually have a beginning. And you start to get guys like Fred Hoyle, one of the great astrophysicists of the last century, who says basically, I think like the universe looks like it's been monkeyed around with by a super intellect. And once you make contact with like the bedrock mysteries of science, things like, okay, particles seem to have this intimate relationship with human consciousness, that like we, by observing particles, help to determine their position in space, their relationship to one another. Like suddenly the world starts to look a lot more like this relationship between the soul and matter. It's like not just this dead world of inanimate stuff kind of moving around. It's actually something much more similar to what's described in the book of Genesis. So yeah, Einstein was wrestled with faith all his life. He had a Jewish upbringing that he kind of rejected, but then came back around to speaking of God. And all of the quantum physicists were well aware that they were dredging up mysteries that seemed actually to go back to like the ancient scriptures. And I think that's just going to continue to be the case more and more, actually.
What do you think about the other kind of side of that, I guess, like creationism? Do
Yeah.
you how do you what are the as someone who is a believer, what are the things that you find that you maybe have to wrestle with the most or come in conflict with the most?
That's a great question. I mean, this is kind of a delicate subject for me because many of my dear friends, whom I respect intellectually, are devoted to like what you would call the 7 day creation, meaning like when it says in the Bible that there was morning and evening the first day, that's like 7 24-hour periods. And if you take the Bible that way, then you do have to believe a lot of things that science seems, at least at this point, to contradict. Like you have to think the earth is nowhere near as old as it looks to our best measurements. And these are things that I can't accept. This is a reading of the Bible that I can't accept. So there is like a struggle and a tension there for that way of reading the Bible. What's really one of the most fascinating things I learned while writing the book is that the idea that we need the Bible to be describing 7 24-hour days might actually be a product itself of the scientific revolution. Because it's in the
Mm.
scientific revolution that people start to say, well, truth is measurable, quantifiable truth. Like that's what's real, stuff that we can measure. And everything else, all these like poetic ways of speaking that we have, the human experience, the way we describe things in myth and story and legend, that's just a kind of fantasy or an embroidery around the real truth. And so then you get this hard and fast opposition between like a quote unquote literal reading of the Bible and one that would take, as I take the book of Genesis to be a profound but allegorical description in human. I mean, basically, what I think the Book of Genesis is doing is it's taking cosmic realities that are only truly known in the mind of God, and it's translating them into human language. And we do this all the time. You know, we say like it was as if my heart dropped into my stomach, and nobody thinks that like I suffered a form of advanced cardiac arrest in that moment. Like nobody, everybody knows that you're speaking a certain way. Jesus talks this way all the time, right? You are my sheep. Like
Mhm.
nobody worries that he's going to use us for sweaters, right? And
Mhm.
and this is like a way that the Bible has of speaking. And if you go back into like the ancient church and you read like Saint Augustine, for instance, Saint Augustine is extremely comfortable with reading Genesis in this way. In fact, I think Augustine has a quantum physics reading of the book of Genesis, even though he didn't know quantum physics, but he's all about like these can't possibly be 24-hour days because the sun hadn't been created for four of them. So how could they have been 24-hour days when there were no hours, no humans, nobody to like experience that time in that way. Um, and so it's not like there weren't young Earth 7-day creationists in the ancient world. It's just that the idea that that's the only faithful way to read the Bible is a very, very new idea, and it actually is based on a scientific idea that the only kind of truth is like hard materialist truth. So for
Mm.
me, that's the most delicate thing because I never want to take people's faith away from them or tell them
Right.
they're like unsophisticated or stupid for reading the Bible a certain way. I don't think that at all. But I do think that if we start out from this position where it's a battle between faithful orthodoxy that takes the Bible at its word in every material particular, or like godless heresy that is led astray by mankind, we've given the game away before it starts. Like that's
Mhm.
sort of allowing the materialists, in some sense, kind of to win, and it makes it very hard to have this sort of dialogue. So yeah, I mean, there's dangers in this that I worry about. Like the Bible can't just mean anything you want it to say. There's words there on the page, and there are ranges of acceptable interpretation. Um, but for me, I think the the hardest thing to do is to break yourself out of that mindset that you're in this like either or dualist argument between the description that the Bible gives of like the 5,000 years or whatever that the earth has been around and the description that science gives of the maybe 13 billion, maybe 26 billion years that the universe has been around. Like I actually think that is not a conflict that actually exists, but it's very, very hard to think past it these days.
Mm. Are you familiar with Emmett Fox and all those guys that were kind
Yeah.
of okay, so when I was wrestling with the, just flinching every time I heard the Lord's Prayer, my sponsor at the time, who was amazing, she encouraged me to read Emmett Fox's breakdown of the Lord's Prayer and why it has stood the test of time, how it could be interpreted, every single line,
Mm,
what it was an allegory for really, and what it was actually saying, and it actually completely changed the way I see the prayer,
mm,
and I don't flinch when I hear it anymore. It was the ability for me to look at it in this way that it was timeless poetry that spoke to these eternal truths
yeah.
that allowed me to even be able to listen to it without having that, like, Catholic schoolgirl flinch of,
Mm,
like, this thing, this
yeah.
mantra."
Yeah. Yeah. It's really hard because people are rightly, Christians, religious people are rightly suspicious of kind of liberalizing or innovative interpretations of the faith because
Mhm.
doctrine is very, very precious. And as you know, true faith is very precious. You cling to it like a life raft in these moments of otherwise complete chaos. And so you're clinging to this like one like plank of wood in a tempest in this enormous ocean of chaos, and somebody comes along and says like, have you considered that maybe things are more mysterious than this particular interpretation? And there really are a lot of people. I mean, Megan Basham at the Daily Wire has written a lot about this. There genuinely are people who, under cover of pretending to be religious kind of try to undermine people's basic moral intuitions. You get this used a lot, like in the immigration debate. You get a lot of people who will use like certain passages from the Bible to say, well, like you can't be a Christian and believe in borders. You have to dissolve your country into soup if you really want to honor God. And
Right.
that's like, a thing that people are rightly very, very wary of. And I think that that's one reason why when you start to talk about this, people get very angsty. Like when I talk to people about Jordan Peterson, one of the first things that people say is, well, isn't he like insufficiently absolute about these religious doctrines? Like he can never really say that God is real. And I do think that like much like yourself as you're describing, like Jordan may well be on a journey to a more like definitely orthodox faith. But there's an amazing novel that I've always loved, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov,
Yeah.
one of the greatest Christian novels I've ever written.
So good.
So beautiful. And it begins, the epigraph to that book is from the Gospel of John: unless a grain of wheat falls on the ground and it dies, it can never produce much fruit, right? You have to kind of allow your faith to reconstitute itself, and
Mhm.
that's the journey that Alyosha takes in that book, right? He starts out, he's in this monastery, he's extremely devout, and Father Zosima, his trusted elder, says you need to go out into the world and encounter like just how difficult these problems really are. And for Alyosha, the whole journey is like he moves through a period of seeing the world as if everything is breaking down, and all of his old certainties fall away, but he has to build them back up in this bigger, more robust way. And they're the same certainties. They just look different. I think we're kind of living through that period now where it's like science has posed all of these challenges to the traditional understanding of faith. And the reaction on a lot of people's parts was just to like totally reject that and just, ignore that that was happening at all. But actually, if you allow yourself to entertain these ideas first, you'll find that there is a bigger understanding of the ancient faith that actually still affirms all the same stuff, just in this like way vaster sphere. So it takes a certain degree, I think, of intellectual courage to trust that and to like allow God to lead you through those periods of doubt and uncertainty.
How did you find your way,
Hmm.
into this?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was lucky growing up that, first of all, I had a very happy, stable childhood. Um, my parents have a beautiful marriage, and they were wonderful parents. And so I was probably at an advantage there from the start because, like, we all take our parents as like models no matter what of I think ultimately we look to our fathers as kind of embodiments of who God is. It's just built into us. And so, especially if you have an abusive father or an absent father, like there's like a much bigger challenge. And so I had a good model. Now, of course, that's not sufficient. Like no person really can be God. But I say all this because from a very early age, even though I was not raised in a religious way at all, I sort of, if you would asked me, I would have said, yeah, there's a God. In fact, I'm told that when I was a little kid, I used to walk outside and thank the sun for shining on me, which
Oh.
I don't remember that, but I definitely, yeah, I recognize myself in that story. My experience of the world is that there's more in it than just raw, brute, dead stuff. There's actually a presence there. And so as I was growing up, I started to confront really like what is that presence? Like, what do I mean by that? And like, if it hasn't become clear already, I'm a huge dork. And so my reaction to this was like, I need to read a lot of books, and I embarked upon, between the ages of 14 and 16, I read every scripture I could get my hands on. I read the Bhagavad Gita, I read the Tao Te Ching, I read like, a bunch of that stuff, some of the Buddhist Vedas. And I read the Bible for the first time during that period because I had been given kind of carte blanche. My parents weren't really religiously observant as I was growing up, and they became so afterward. But I was really just like looking for somebody to explain to me like what I meant by there's a God out there.
Mhm.
And At exactly the same time, probably not unrelatedly, I I was becoming aware that I am gay, and so I was, like, having a kind of personal crisis along as I was having this intellectual crisis, and, I was in a fairly tolerant environment, but there's just a lot of angst associated with that discovery, I think even now for anybody, and so I did not know what to do about this, and I reached a point after my sort of scriptural journeys where I was interested in everything I read, found a lot of beautiful stuff in basically every piece of scripture I read from all these different traditions. But the Bible became the book that sat on my nightstand that I would like
Hmm.
turn to for comfort. And I think if I have to explain why, it's just that I recognized the the guy I met there. I recognized the character of God in the history of the Jews and in the person of Jesus. And that presence that I'd met all my life, that I felt as a benevolent presence in the sun, in the world around me. When I read about Jesus, I was like, that's my guy. I recognize this guy. So I wasn't a Christian, but I was relying on the Bible in this way. And one night I was up very, very late because I just couldn't see my way to talking to anybody about the fact that I was trying to date girls. It wasn't working. I couldn't live the sort of normal life that I really desperately wanted to live. And I paged through my Bible, and I have this Gideon's Bible, one of those ones they leave in hotel rooms, the blue
Yep.
cover. I think I have it sitting around here somewhere still. And it's those pages are stained with my tears. Like, this is like a really important object for me because at that moment I opened to the front section where John 3:16 is translated into like every possible language. It's the most translated sentence I think in any language. It's for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son to live and die as one of us. That whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And it's just that verse over and over again in French, in Hindi, in Italian, in Greek. And I'm a language nerd and I was really interested in languages. So I was just like kind of occupying myself with reading these different versions of the word. And I had what I can only describe as a mystical experience in which the small w words fell away and the capital W word was like present in the room with me. I was like, oh, I
Mm.
actually believe this. I believe this. I believe in this more than I believe in atoms. Like I actually believe in this as a fundamental reality of the world, that this broken mess that I am is beloved by like a perfect cosmic creator.
Wow.
And I mean, I'm choking up a little bit talking about it because it is it was a very profound moment. And I always want to be really careful telling the story that, like, obviously, homosexuality and Christianity is this enormous, thorny topic, and what happened in that moment was not that, like, Jesus said to me, "It's okay, come out, you're gonna be fine."
Yeah.
Gay is great or whatever. Like, that's not what happened. Instead, what happened is that became the primary truth of my life, and I thought, if this is the first thing, then truth is more important than anything else. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to people about this and I'm going to sort of be open with it and work through it. And it's possible that that saved my life. Like it was within a couple weeks that I like came out to my parents and started to work through this in a way that was like much more healthy, that was not just like inward looking and sort of self-contained. um and from there, anytime something just seemed intractable to me, like I had no motivation to get up and brush my teeth, that's when I just started talking to God. And
Mm.
so it's for somebody like me who writes a lot of philosophical stuff and does a lot of academic theology. It's not really an academic story. It's really a personal story, but it is a rock bottom story of a sort. That's how it happened.
How do you square that, as you say, that thorny topic of, homosexuality and Christianity? Does
Yeah.
is there, um, even I've had It's weird moving to Texas, I've had to confront this more with people who are like, "Well, that's a abomination," or like, "That's the slippery slope," or whatever. And I grew
Yeah,
up in a very liberal environment where I was just not exposed to or had to confront that at all.
right, right. Well, of course, the case for homosexuality as an abomination is very old and very scriptural, and it's not something that people adopt simply out of prejudice. I think that's an important thing to get on the table. You know, nowadays we'll say like, "Oh, these hateful Christians, like they just want to steal your fun or whatever." That's not the case at all. I mean, this is people who really feel that there's a created order, that it is centered around male and female, that God creates man and woman in the garden, and this is cosmic, and that anything outside of that is sin, essentially walking away from the teaching of the church and from the way that God intends the world to be. And I see the force of that argument, and I actually think there's a version of it that I do believe. I
Mm.
unlike perhaps a lot of like gay affirming Christians or whatever, my perspective is not that like all love relationships are created equal, and that like, my marriage to my husband is the same as like a traditional marriage between a man and a woman. I actually don't think that. I think that when God creates the universe, he defines the core of normalcy. He defines the way the world is structured. And so I think the union between a man and woman producing children is at the center of life. And it's even possible that like in some abstract sense, that's all that's creation. That's just what God made. After the fall, however, we all of us have slipped off of that track to some extent. And there are things like the old Jewish laws, for instance, that describe like perfect righteousness. And one of the things that St. Paul says that is very powerful is that the whole purpose of that law was to show that all have fallen short of it, was to reveal that actually we're not capable of keeping the law. And I think that every one of us, to some extent, has to work from where he finds himself or she finds herself relative to that perfect ideal.
Mhm.
And St. Paul, in some of the passages people like to cite, refers to people that have slipped off that track and are just like wholly lost to the perfect way of creation. And he includes arsenokoitai and malakoi, which is often translated as homosexuals. It's actually two concepts, one of which is like man betters and the other one is softies. So it's sort of like effeminacy and those who sleep with men. And you can totally see, looking at the ancient world, that there was a ton of just like unhinged debauchery, kind of like now. Now a
Yeah.
lot of people in the name of like LGBTQ plus whatever are saying, yeah, like we should just have polymorphous perversity all the time.
Mhm.
But the next thing Paul says, right, is that this is people who are turned away from their natural inclinations, and the fruit of their sin is in social chaos and dysfunction. And when I look at my own life and experience, I feel like I'm always in the business of trying to like hold up my life and experience to this description that the Bible gives of the world. And it's simply not the case that I'm somebody who like willfully abandoned a natural heterosexuality because I was abused or because like I was taught that everything goes and everything is permissible. In fact, this is something that has been not just a sexual desire, which is kind of, we confuse this a lot. We think it's just about sex. Actually, this is about, what I was discovering is that I was falling in love with other men, and that
Right.
love relationships for me, like in their erotic dimension, are aimed that way.
Mhm.
And so it became a question more about like, is it possible to produce what Paul calls the fruits of the spirit in a moderate gay relationship that is a monogamous one, like a non extreme crazy one. And the experience of my life has been that yes, it is in fact a source of joy and flourishing for me. Now, I've come to view this as kind of like a jazz riff upon creation. If there's like this theme of creation that is male and female, I think that, in fact, at least after the fall, God is a lot more creative than we give him credit for. And
Mm,
there are variations and jazz riffs and arabesques on the side of this design that actually contribute to its beauty. I mean, you would not want everybody to be a violin player, but to have some violin players is, in fact, like an ornamentation, a joy of life. And the question that gay Christians are facing is it possible for us to be peripheral ornamentations upon a, a created order that we support? You know, like can we endorse and affirm heterosexual marriage as the core of civilization while also staking out our own place, you know, kind of like room in that mention. And it's an open question. I mean, we're working this out civilizationally now, but I actually think that that is the way to get around what would otherwise be an impossible straitjacket for everybody. Like nobody
right,
can actually live in like this perfectly laid out rule, and that's grace, right? Grace is that God has actually met us in the variety of our, to use a totally abused word, diversity, right? Like we are
right.
actually a various creation. So that's where I'm at about it. I know that people of goodwill are elsewhere, but that's where
Yeah,
I ended up.
that's awesome. I mean, it's just it's so I don't know. I'm so fascinated by, like, the people like yourselves who live this and think deeply about it and have to wrestle with these kind of conflicting ideologies when I would say that you're extremely beautiful example of Christianity. And, I've also been online and I've seen the way people who believe one thing will, we are just very tribal. We're just
Mm,
very tribal individuals. I was thinking too about the way, just in another side note that I was thinking about, and I've been working on a stand up routine about this, but
mm,
you would be like a good person to inform I always want to have like a deeper something behind it. Um, we live in this time where it's like, "Oh, I wanna be able to see it and calculate it and have results," and it's all download even online, it's downloads and numbers
yeah,
and it's the al and I'm like, "We
metrics.
all sound like psychopaths talking about the algorithm, though."
Yeah,
We all sound it's literally primitive brain talking about the ancient gods who are gonna get mad at us.
sure
Nobody
is.
really knows how it works. No one knows any people can kind of hack it and get very like you said, kind of spurg out around this thing
Yeah,
and
yeah,
figure
yeah,
out how to hack it, but it everyone I've been trying to work on it's going well. Took
yeah.
it out this week where it's like we're all like, "Oh no, we must feed the algorithm. If we give it something it doesn't like, it will ignore us for 3 days." It's like the way ancients talked about the weather.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a little embarrassed rolling out my own highly amateur comedy routine in the presence of a professional, but I have this joke that I don't shop, I speak my intentions into the algorithm. Because like nowadays, if there's something you want that you're looking for, you can just like Google where do I get a good pair of like knee braces or something, but you can also just sort of type about knee braces. You
Oh,
can like
yeah.
mention on Twitter that it's happening. You
You can
can
talk about it.
in the presence of Alexa, exactly, and like suddenly your Instagram feed is going to deliver you a much better result than like you could ever give. It's really creepy.
Yeah.
And yeah, like we have a religion of data. This is totally a false god that we've installed and established. And we are at its mercy to a certain extent. Like
Yeah, we
people talk
definitely are.
online in a way that they never talk in person. And like I have so many dear friends who are highly concerned about my soul vis-a-vis homosexuality.
Uh-huh.
And we have had long conversations about it and kind of shared ideas about it. And it's never devolved into anything like kind of anger or acrimony. In fact, it's been some of my richest relationships take place across this divide. And it's because those relationships take place within a context of love. And when St. Paul says, like, you could have the faith to move mountains, you could have the tongue to speak of men and of angels, but if I have not love, I am nothing. I mean, it's such a galaxy brain passage. It really sets your hair on fire when he says, like, all of the stuff, including your religion, like including your obedience to religious law, including the, tithing that you give, the way you go to church on Sunday, like all of that can be damned or blessed, and the only difference is love. And it's such an abused word that we find this like really unsatisfying. But you can see it when you take those relationships that you have where you talk about these things and you struggle with them and you work with them, and then you compare them to what goes on online. And
Yeah.
like, as you say, you don't need me to tell you this. It's like, of course, I get nasty stuff said to me online. You get nasty stuff said
Oh,
to you
yeah.
online, like all the like horrendous things that nobody would ever say to your face, or I hope nobody would say that to your face. And I just look at this as like this is a kind of victimization. Like another Dostoevsky line that I love from Crime and Punishment, when finally the murderer admits to his love that he has murdered somebody. She says, "What have you done? What have you done to yourself?" And
Mhm.
it's like I read like, and by the way, it's not just the gay thing, right? I mean, these days it's usually you're a gay Jew, right? And I just think like, okay, first of all, brilliant, you figured it out. Like, I'm a gay guy with Jewish heritage, like you genius sleuth. But also, it's like you have to, you have to be that person now. Like, you have to be kind of trapped in that mode of thought. And this is where like praying for your enemies really kind of comes in, I think, is that in order to pray for them, you actually have to practice like a high degree of empathy. You have to think about like what's it like to be this person, and like what would it mean to want the best for this person. And I know for sure that to want the best for my haters, like, peace and love to all my haters, like it would certainly be to escape, right, from like these, to escape
Uh,
from this trap. And again, it's not that there's no loving way to think that homosexuality is wrong. It's just that if that is your like whole philosophy, is like somebody else is doing something bad, I think that might be hell. Like, I think you're already in
yeah.
hell, is like when your whole life is about like other people are doing things I don't like. People are wrong online, and like my whole life is about like I cannot be happy or fulfilled until that is solved. Um, People hate it when you cite the judge not passage, because instantly they'll say yes, but like Jesus said that, and then he said go and sin no more, and like this is true. Are you Jesus? Like, did he stutter? Like, take the plank out of your own eye. Like, the whole thing is there. Jesus says, "I've come that may have life. He's there that your joy may be full." And we can argue about whether my joy could be fuller if I were celibate or whatever. But at the end of the day, right? Like, the real question is, how's your joy doing? Like, is this conducive to your joy? And I think like the less time we spend hanging our joy on whether other people are wrong or right, the more, in fact, life turns out to be like filled with the stuff, filled with joy, if you can just like put your judgment aside for a second and love people.
I think that should be your next book. Peace
Oh
and love
boy,
t No,
peace
it
and love
should
to my
be.
haters.
Peace and
Yeah.
love to all my haters.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I'm
And
still
just about this. I mean, I
mhm,
think so many people wrestle with, some version of this,
right.
and we live in a time that is, for all of the tolerance, extremely intolerant, and the lack of paths to redemption. And it's not just on the left, which I've been very critical of. This ideology has no redemption. Cancel culture it's been talked about ad nauseum, but there's that kind of ancient version of this as well that you see playing out where I wrote this piece about like how I regret being a slut, and I joke a lot about being a reform slut, and I'll have people come at me from the right where it's like, well, we don't want your whore kind, or we don't want your whore vote. And there are many people like myself who wrestle with this. Well, okay, if I don't feel loved coming from where I came from or going to where I may be going,
Yeah.
where do you find yourself? And I think there's a lot of that. There's someone smart needs to speak to this, and it might be you.
Oh boy. Well, I'll take that on board for sure. I mean, like, yeah, this is the thing, right? Is it's very easy to start when people yell at you online, it feels awful because when a homeless crazy person online or when a homeless crazy person on the street yells at you, it also feels awful. Like
Right.
we all carry so much genuine guilt because we are all, part of the faith is that we are actually all sinful. And so we do have this deep sense that we are not as we are supposed to be. And we're always trying, or at least I hope, to kind of like just reorient ourselves one notch toward the good. And we're always failing. Like the minute you start doing that, the minute you realize how hard it is. And so anybody can say anything. Like you walk by some guy on the street and he goes, "You suck," and you instantly like, "Oh my gosh, how does he know? Like I do suck." Like
Yeah.
that's, and so of course,
He
like you
saw
gotta,
right through me.
oh my gosh, like this brilliant man, he must be a visionary. But it's like, no, it's even a stop clock. You tell me I'm bad. Like you're not saying anything worse than I could possibly say to myself. And so it's very, very tempting to just think, well, like, what is the way of life? And, if I just reformed this, then these people would stop yelling at me, right? Like, if I could just live a different life, then they wouldn't call me a whore, or they wouldn't call me a gay Jew, or they wouldn't whatever. It's like that's not true. Like there would be something else. There genuinely is always, this is like this purity spiral that we are talking about is insatiable because it is diabolical. I mean, that's sort
Mm,
of how satanic logic works, is it just devours more and more of you. And the left is of course a great example of this too, as you say, right? Like no concession is enough. You go to
mhm.
apologize for the supposedly racist thing you said, and it's not like you are now suddenly in good standing. It's just that the next thing that you fall afoul of that they invented 5 minutes ago will be another reason to hold you to account. It's all a method of control. And I think that, like, yeah, the right recently has a problem with this as well. We're not as philosophically devoted to it as the left is, which is a great advantage. The left is actually philosophically committed to its purity culture in a way that
Right.
we maybe are not. But it's the same dynamic, and it is a game that nobody ever wins. And so
Mhm.
you're just never going to get anywhere by trying to live up to the eyes of like a troll online. Like you're just
Right.
not. At the end of the day, you simply have to, through prayer, reading, reflection, and genuine friends who actually love you. You have to be about the business of figuring out for yourself, like where joy lies, and like the more of us that get offline and touch grass, the more of us, I think, start to realize this. The whole game is rigged, even when you're winning it.
What is your morning routine? Is it good, or do you struggle with it?
I'm the worst about this. I'm sorry. I am good at it, and I know this is like awful and annoying. But I'm a 5 a.m. riser. I've always been a morning person. I'm an early morning supremacist. I don't actually think that staying up late and getting up early are the same. I think getting up early is more helpful, especially for writers. This might be a writer thing, but the 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. block is writing time.
Yeah,
And
that's true
so
for me too.
really? Yeah, yeah. So I do, I have there's a wonderful passage in C.S. Lewis where he says you wake up and all of the darkness of the world has like crowded around you and everything is instantly demanding your attention, pulling you away from the most important things. So the very first thing you do should be to reach for something that like reminds you of what track you're on. So usually for me, I've been trying to read the whole Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, and so I do 5 verses of that in the morning, and then I pray. And I've been doing the liturgy of the hours, the classic morning prayer at 6 a.m., and then there's a 9 a.m., a 12 a.m., a 3 p.m., a 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and an evening prayer. Um, and then yeah, it's basically just work from there. My life is basically my work.
Okay.
What about you?
Ugh, it's a mess right now. I feel like such a mess. I mean, it's so hard with I was saying this last night. I was like, nothing makes me feel like more of a failure than bedtime. It's just like, and I'm sure I'm not the only parent that feels that way, but it is like, she's just, it's everyone has their struggle, I think, with I mean, some kids might just be perfect angels, but it seems like everyone kind of has the one thing or the other, like, oh, the kid
Mhm.
might sleep, but they're like eating is bad. It's like always, she's been always so good about eating and everything, even sleeping when she's asleep. She used to until she got like a cold. And now this is again, just like you hear this from all parents, they get sick and then it throws everything off.
Right, right.
Um, so yeah, the but never has this child gone it's like, will not go to bed without a fight since she was an
Yeah,
infant. Like,
yeah,
just will not, just it is and her name means mighty in battle, and I named her that because 'cause I'm like, "This is a name she will." I felt it in my body when she was in me, I felt and then I just underestimated how much I would be turned against me.
yeah.
I'm like, "Why didn't I think this battle would be against me?" I'm
Yeah,
like, "She's
yeah,
gonna need this in the world," and
sure.
I forgot, the first part of her world is us.
Mm,
And she's just so it's destroyed any semblance. I'll see a lot of people post about this online. Chris Williamson recently had his like morning routine, and everyone in his comments was just, "Tell me you don't have a child without
yeah,
telling me you
yeah,
don't have a child."
totally.
But
It is
that's not an excuse either, because it's an easy way for me to excuse just a lot of bad behavior around my cell phone and, like, I used to wake up, and my husband and I would both before we had kids, we joke about this all the time. Before we had kids, we did have, like, a morning routine of reading our dailies from, recovery, praying, meditating, and there's this 3rd step prayer in recovery, and one of the lines is, relieve me of the bondage of self in this prayer. And my husband had it made for me. So we put it up in our room. And it's like, we joke that when I found out I was pregnant and then we had a child and saw the all encompassing thing that is, we were like, we meant like give us more time to, to meditate, like I didn't mean actually relieve me of the
yeah,
bondage of self.
the inconvenient parts. I wanna keep the, like,
It's like, oh,
productivity. Now,
yeah.
but
So,
this is you're doing the point of life, right? I mean, I I have to feel I don't have kids myself, so I'm speaking from there's a great line in A Christmas Carol where this guy's trying to woo a woman, and he says, "Alas, as a bachelor, I'm a wretched outcast, with no standing to opine on such a tender, delicate subject." So, what do I know? But it seems like yeah, there's probably stuff you could be doing if you weren't being present for your child, but what would be the point of any of it, right? I mean, that's like
This is
what
why
you
people
are
have
about.
night nurses and nannies and all that
Oh,
stuff that
yeah.
rich people have that we don't I mean, I get it. You don't have to, like, deal with the battle, it's just like, you get to be like, "Good night, child," like Downton Abbey, and then be like, "Off to the nursery with you."
Right, right.
And not
Well,
have that, like, I'm going to kill you if you don't stop asking me for they're just it does make me understand, like, every meme that gets fed to me on Instagram, though,
right.
my husband and I were talking about how we'll, like, just scroll through reels now because 'cause we're so exhausted, and when we finally get to even sleep together, which is rare if she's, like, having a rough night,
Yep.
we were like, there's no shared comedy anymore. There's
Mm,
no, like, sitcom, and I saw actually Amanda Fortini, Walter Kern's wife, posting about this. I was like, "Oh, are we just alone doing this?" But no, it seems like a lot of people are sharing these reels and memes where it's like, when your kid won't get and it's just these very basic things about being, like, a middle class parent
yeah,
that is not reflected in any of our media. I was like,
yeah,
we just don't have that shared, like, Roseanne or show that everybody kinda used to watch to get that relief of like, "Oh, I'm not
mm,
alone. I'm
yeah,
not a horrible mom because I can't get my kid to bed because she's negotiating with me about, like, this 17." there was one the other day that went around that's like, no one has a bigger to-do list than a toddler going to bed.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, thank God we're not alone."
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they're
yeah.
just we don't have that, like, thing right now other than Instagram Reels, which kind of
Mm.
feels sad to me.
Well, present company accepted, right? I mean, you're it. That's probably a major dimension of your appeal and success, right, as a comedian. And I think it's something that when once you become a part of a political cadre online, it's like very easy to let that become the death of comedy because political ideologies, left and right, are designed not to like face up to the hilarities of the world, but to restrict them, right? And to keep
Right.
them from spiraling out of control. And there's a lot of use to that, but it's also not a complete life. And so I think one of the things that makes comedy so hard, but also so rewarding right now, and why comedians have become some of the most important cultural figures, is that there's a huge relief in just like telling it like it is, essentially, like
Right.
being able to acknowledge, yeah, of course we want to recover the traditional family and we all want to be like trad wives and trad husbands or whatever that, like, I don't know what the equivalent is. Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a trad husband in the same way that there,
Shocker.
yeah, right, exactly. But like, that, and yet we are also 21st century people, and to a certain extent we're larping when we talk about this stuff, and like there's just kind of messy realities there that um yeah, we the minute we recover that, like, honesty in art, I feel like we just notice it instantly. Like that's the stickiness of those viral reels is in part just like, oh, thank God somebody
Yep.
is saying what I've been thinking in some way.
It's true. It was why I was really torn about I straddle 2 different worlds, well, many
Mhm.
different worlds, but it was why I was so torn about putting out a video that I put out right before the election where I just was honest about the fact that I had voted for Trump and
Yeah,
that I was going to, which coming from someone who voted for Hillary in 2016, that journey has been, I want to write about it because I think many people have made that journey along with me, even just the numbers from this election kind of show that, but
right.
aside from that, I was torn because the comedian in me really doesn't feel like I A, owe it to anybody to tell them how I voted. B, it doesn't help my comedy to let people know that. And C, it goes against kind of everything I believe as a comedian to be like,
Hmm.
I'm not in I didn't endorse him, I guess tacitly by saying I was voting for him. It is an endorsement, but I was just like, it was really a vote against something, and here's why I'm doing it, but because I'm also a commentator and write a column that can be serious at times, and the most recent column I'd had was about how I was really struggling with kind of wanting to vote for Trump, but not
Hmm.
being sure that I could pull that trigger. Um, I felt like I owed it to my audience to be honest. People are like, "Oh, I thought your brand was political homelessness," and it's like, well, no, I mean, I talk a lot about it, but it's mostly just trying to me being honest about what I'm wrestling with is my brand. It's not me, like, I'm not MAGA, I'm not and I wasn't so I really struggle with that as a comedian. It felt like in some ways abandoning what I believe makes you a good comic, but in other ways I felt like I owed it to my audience not to be cheeky, not to be cowardly and come out afterwards and say that I had done it. It was like take it to, just get off the fence. I was getting off the fence and to be honest about that and then let the chips fall where they may. I mean, could
Yeah,
it I'm great that he won. It proved a lot of things that I've been saying for many years accurate, but I didn't know that when I did that video, like the
right,
Friday
right.
before the election.
Well, it always fascinates me how much there is online where people will express a sense of betrayal. And that's one of the most interesting reactions to me, that you say something which is maybe unexpected, or you say something that your audience generally disagrees with. And the word that comes up is you've betrayed whatever, the conservative movement, you've betrayed like comedy, you've betrayed your audience, And I just think like where is the contract that I signed to embody all of those things? Like if you think I have deviated from proper conservative orthodoxy, great. Like I'm a guy, you're a guy, we're all just guys and gals in the world. Like then adjust your like hold a different belief from me. But that's not actually the relationship that we find ourselves in as creators. I think in the end what we're really talking about is this enormous cacophony of voices where everybody feels kind of drowned out and alone, and you find somebody you agree with and you think, oh, here is somebody who can speak for me. And
Mm,
we didn't know we were doing that. We were just speaking. We were speaking for ourselves, right? And yeah, I call myself a conservative. I have beliefs that are conservative, and my general outlook is one that kind of aligns, I think, with like a Burkean sort of traditionalism. Um, but ultimately, I believe those things because I believe them to be true, not because they are conservatism.
right.
And there are truths that conservatism as a hard and fast ideology doesn't capture that also need acknowledgement and incorporation. And again, I am but one man. Like other people will have like differing opinions about that. And all of that actually seems like a really beautiful, very American thing for us to be engaging in that dialogue.
Yes.
But, you know, the attractiveness of that tribalism and of the teams is that if there is a box called conservatism in which exist all the like correct opinions, then we can mass produce that box and we can like appoint people to hawk to sell that product. And then when you've sort of like cast your favorite podcaster or like creator in that role, and suddenly they turn out to be a human with like a variety of interesting opinions, not all of which fit in that box, it's suddenly like they have like gone back on some contract. And uh, really I feel that what this ultimately is a consequence of loneliness. It's like people need you to say what they believe because people listen to and care about what you say, and the people who are angry don't feel like what they say is taken seriously and don't
Hmm.
feel like they are listened to, and they feel like they need somebody that is going to take them seriously and agree with them or at least respect their opinions. And it's like, who's really great at doing that? Your family. Like your family is supposed to be the space where your opinion really matters, where like you can gather together with like-minded people and you can like be valued and cared for in that way. And so many people are lacking that, not only
Yeah.
because like marriage is in such a terrible state, but also because friendship is in such a terrible state. Like
Yeah.
the authenticity of like face-to-face interaction is really lost. And when you offload that onto your parasocial relationships, you end up placing this burden upon like comedians, pundits, whoever, that like you don't even want them to sustain. Like I don't really want you to say everything I believe. I want you to say interesting things that I don't believe and like make me laugh or make me think. And
Yeah.
uh yeah, this is like a really we got to get over this. And I sort of think like family life and friendship is kind of the way out of
I hope so. What's your biggest defect of character?
oh man, how much time do you have? um Despair. I
Mm,
Despair is a sin, and I am very prone to it. I wake up in the morning with a lot of sorrow, and that creates lethargy, sloth, which is another sin. um and I think it's because if I had to psychologize myself, I have through my life generally been pretty good at a lot of things. And so when I acknowledge that, like, there are many, many ways that I fall short, and when I can't actually do stuff as well as I want to, which is most of the time. Anything you produce, like even when you're happy with your work, it still doesn't live up to like what it could be, right? And so
Oh,
I
do
can,
I know that?
yeah. Everybody, I think, faces up to this, like uh, in the dark corners of his or her heart. And so, yeah, I'm a perfectionist, and I despair as a result, which is wrong.
What is your biggest asset?
Um, it is sincerity of love. Um, I love the things that I love inordinately and frankly. Um, and actually, I shouldn't say inordinately, because that is actually wrong, to love things in the wrong measure. But I actually think that most sins are not loving the wrong thing too much. They're loving the right things too little.
Mm,
And I think that, like, one of my true assets in life has always been that I like love to be like happy, and I love joy, and like I actually think that when other people are happy, by and large, like truly sincerely happy, not pretending to be happy as they destroy themselves, but like actually flourishing, I think that actually brings me great joy, and that's kind of like my saving grace.
hmm. Where can we find you?
On Substack, probably the best place now. Rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's where I talk about my books and my podcast and everything. And for my sins, I tweet. So at Spencer Klavan.
We all tweet for our sins.
This side
You're
of
such a joy. I just love you,
I love you
truly.
back. Thank you for
It's
having
been
me.
so
This is
nice to talk to you. I feel
Yeah,
like we have to be in better touch.
I would like that a lot.
You're
Let's do that.
doing a lot of important work out there.
Well, same to you. Takes it's gonna take all of us, and I'm glad to be uh, perhaps on your team, given what we've discussed is the wrong phrase, but I'm
Yeah,
glad to be your friend. I'll say
I'm glad to be your friend. Thank you so much for coming on and for your time.
thank you for having me.
The check-in with Bridget and Cousin Maggie can now be found at Phetasy.com. It's been titled Another Round with Bridget Phetasy, and it's now in video.
This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.